Hi, welcome to the September weirdly scheduled edition of the Scarlet Quill Society. If you are tuning in because the wrong date was in some of our material, we are so sorry. Um, we'd like to thank Chris for showing up. um, and I want to note that we're going to do our best to make sure that all of your questions get answered, whether you were able to make it to this meeting or not. We are in negotiations for a do-over for you. We're awesome. We're great. We're on top of it. We're adults. We're also living through just a genuinely disrespectful number of heat numbers outside. Like, I don't love this weather. So excuse me if I sneeze because we are having some sort of spring renaissance in the tree pollen situation. Um, we'll see how it goes. Uh, Dead silence for 5, 4, 3. Yeah, right. It is our custom to open with a land acknowledgement and to invite our guests to give a land acknowledgement. And because our call is so small this week, I happen to know that everyone is covered by the standard yeah right land acknowledgement. So I just want to let folks know that's why I'm not inviting Chris to give a separate acknowledgement. Yeah right is it's I mean, we're virtual, obviously, right? We're a global community of writers and editors and people who just genuinely want to make their writing better. But even while we move towards virtual connection, we do have a nexus with the land and a responsibility to the land. And as part of right's acknowledgement of our responsibility, we have a duty of stewardship to land that has historically and is currently inhabited by a number of indigenous people, the tribes of Multnomah, Wasco. I'm going to apparently not be able to pronounce anything this week, despite doing this all year. Cowlitz, Kathlamet, and Clackamas, the bands of Chinook, the Tualatin, Kalapuya, and the Malala. And as part of our duty to them and our acknowledgement that we are on their land, their unceded land, certainly on the west coast of the United States, we donate to the Naya Family Center as part of our land acknowledgement. And Naya provides, I'm going to read this very carefully today. Naya provides culturally specific programs and services that guide people in the direction of personal success and balance through cultural empowerment. And we invite and encourage you as part of your own land acknowledgements to do the same, to take your action just a little bit further. If you're not entirely sure how to do this, you're watching us on YouTube right now, go to the channel, and while you're down there, like and subscribe, hit the bell, do all the YouTube things. But go back to last month's Scarlet Quill Society, last month, I think, where our guest TC had some incredibly good suggestions for ways to reach beyond the standard land acknowledgement and look into native foodways and so on and so forth, especially right now where in the Southern Hemisphere, it's spring planting time, and here it is fall planting time. So think about indigenous foodways, about seeds, about the land. Now that I have taken up a genuinely unconscionable amount of time, I'd like to introduce our guest, who I have only gently browbeat into coming on our channel. Chris is one of my oldest friends. And when I mean one of my oldest friends, I mean we have 20th century friendship. We played video games together when we were kids. He is way too familiar with the terrible, terrible tropes that I love in movies, in TV, in video games. He has agreed to be essentially the victim of all of my questions this week and all of yours. And he's also a U.S. Army combat veteran who has been deployed in several theaters and who is mostly good at ducking, but not as good as he may be ideally, not as good as your mother would like you to be.
That's fair.
So I kind of want to jump right in, but I also kind of like, I'm not sure where to start because I know we've watched so many, and we were talking the other night about like Black Hawk Down and what's going on there. And we've talked about, we watched Lord of the Rings together. We watched part of that terrible Hobbit situation together. I blame you. But I want to jump in with my personal problematic fave, Horatio Hornblower.
All right.
And this is like the tropiest trope to end all tropes. And before we jump into it, I want to just frame this and note that we put tropes like this in our writing. We injure our characters not just because we can, but to do something. Which makes it a little less senseless than violence in the real world, slightly, but not much. So when we put injuries in our stories, we're doing it to raise the stakes, to show personal connection, to show that this character is in genuine danger. And then we get to my personal favorite. Spoilers, there's a big ship-to-ship battle in one of the, books, episodes. My personal favorites, the BBC Hornblower series. Those are some very pretty boys. And they love each other so much. And there's a huge battle, and we have our two main character, best friends forever, bromance, the ship that launched 1,000 slashes, Horatio and Archie. And we get to the end of the battle, and everyone's fine. We're talking, we're doing this sort of after battle thing, and then Archie just collapses because he's covered in blood. Boom. And Horatio's like, "Oh, Archie, is that your blood?" And but how realistic is that? Like, do people do that? Is that something like you can just kind of shrug it off and then all of a sudden you just fall on your face because you're covered in your own blood?
Well, so to answer your question, yes, no, maybe. So shock is an amazing thing that the human body does. And when I was first deployed, I was having a conversation with one of the guys I worked with, and he's like, getting shot sucks. The first time is actually the easiest because shock is an amazing thing. Your body stops responding to pain, it isolates the area, and while it hurts, it doesn't feel like it does later, right? So the worst time is the second time you get shot because you're in shock and you go, "I know what's coming," and that's such a horrible thing. But in the case of what you're talking about with Archie, like absolutely okay, so I'm gonna use a phrase humorously here, but we all remember when the internet was described as a series of tubes, right?
Right.
Well, so is the human body, right? You have to remember that like there's
Right.
a lot of tubes in the inside of the human body that pump blood. However,
not all of them are as important as the others.
Well, then there's a lot of interstitial spaces where you can literally have a through and through of something, and it didn't hit anything vital. It didn't puncture a vein. It didn't hit an organ. Maybe it pushed something to the side instead of penetrating it and went in and out of you. And all you have is a major risk for infection and some muscle damage, which all is not necessarily a small thing. But so, like, I have definitely seen people take a piece of rebar punched through their stomach front to back.
So
Right.
that's concrete reinforcement bar,
Yeah.
right? For folks who
Yeah. Like
don't have it's about a centimeter and a half ish.
Yeah, about that.
To 2 centimeters in
Yeah.
diameter, and it's usually rusty.
Usually rusty, and it's ribbed, and so it's what they use to hold up like that they put into concrete buildings. When you see them pouring concrete, it's the metal bars
that
that
metal,
see.
Yeah.
So I had a friend of mine get knocked off of a wall and land, and essentially skewer himself through his abdomen with a piece of rebar. Right?
Don't do that. Don't try this at home, kids.
Don't do that. However, so we're all freaking out. We get over there, and the medic is with us. It's like, okay, we're gonna like. So we actually just cut the rebar because in a lot of cases of a penetrative wound like that, you don't want to remove the penetrating object because if it is going through an artery or a vein or something like that, leaving it in place means while you're still leaking blood,
okay,
it doesn't gush, right? So
right.
We actually went and cut the piece of rebar, took him all the way back. Like, God, it was like a 2.5 hour ride in a Humvee.
Oh God.
Right.
No, thank you.
Got him back to the combat surgical hospital. They x-rayed him and were like, yoink, you're fine. And we're all like, I mean, they gave him lidocaine first, but they literally just pulled it out. They're like, it didn't hit anything. Like they x-rayed him, they gave him a CAT scan, all of this stuff, and they're just like, that is the one in a million shot that never happens, right? It's like you get hit in the abdomen and there's so much stuff in there, right? And like I was talking to the doctor afterwards, he's like, basically probably what happened is it actually, as it was coming through, because it was a blunted end, which
Right.
makes it worse actually. Uh, Instead of penetrating stuff, it was just pushing intestine away. So it just kind of like went through all the loops of the intestine and then came out the front, right? And he's like, I've been a doctor in the army for like 13 years at this point. Never in my life have I seen anything like that. But
All right. So if you're going to put that in your story, caution, never in this doctor's life. Um,
yeah, but again, like that's something you
can
also have
happen.
to remember.
Yeah.
Yeah, like you're it's not like your internal organs are glued in place. They are still freely floating in uh
Meat juice.
essentially inside meat juice. Yeah. Um so like things do move, right? Like if you've ever watched like a hospital procedural, whether like they've got somebody cracked open and they're pushing, see, be it like Chicago Med or MASH or one of those, right? Like when they've got somebody cracked open and they're rooting around there, all that stuff moves, right? It's held in place by tissue, but you can pick it up and move it if you need to, right?
Right.
Same thing with penetrative wounds like that. Is it likely to happen? No, right?
Right.
So
So the other thing that you see always in like movies is somebody falls on something like that. You see them on the ground, it's protruding out the front a little bit, and then they haul themselves up off of it.
that's a good way to kill yourself, right?
But
Because
could you even like, I can't picture being able to use my abs like that. Like I had a very minor abdominal surgery and it took me a week to walk again.
so depending on where the wound is, yes, because your abdominal muscles are actually split into four panels, right? Like
Right, yeah.
if you look at Ken in the new Barbie movie, right, you can see the obliques in the central abdominal panels, right? All of those act as independent muscle groups. So if unless you puncture in between two of those, you still have the rest of that abdominal group. Is it going to hurt? Absolutely. But again, shock is an amazing thing. I mean, it's
Yep.
to our own detriment, right? Like, I've definitely seen people essentially almost kill themselves because they kept going too long because they were in shock and they almost bled
Mm-hmm.
out, right? So, yes, you could do it. Would you want to? No. And if you were given the option of just laying there and going, ow, that really hurts, you're probably going to choose that. Unless,
Fair.
a Velociraptor or Tyrannosaurus Rex is chasing you across the ground, then I'm probably going to get it up and run too.
Now that we've had Velociraptors and Barbies, this is probably a good point to note that we are discussing a bunch of media properties this month, and the WGA and SAG-AFTRA strikes are still on. It is my understanding from industry friends that what we're doing in terms of discussing previously made properties, not promotionally, but in terms of critique, is within the bounds of what's permissible during the strike. But as always, writers support writers. Folks, if you have the cash to donate, go. We'll put the links in the description. Please take care of other writers if you can. Studios are really trying to put the squeeze on. Now that I've made my other overt political statement.
Fair enough.
So speaking of abdominal injuries, I also do want to put out there that birth is an abdominal injury. It is a major body injury, and if you are writing a story with birth in it, whether it is a cesarean section, whether it is a vaginal birth, talk to at least one person who has given birth if you're trying to figure out how soon your character can do something afterwards and what they can do. No two birth experiences are the same, is my understanding. I haven't done it myself. I plan to continue not doing it myself, but I do have people that I talk to when I'm writing a story that involves childbirth or pregnancy, because it is a major abdominal trauma. Whether or not you consider it the miracle of life, it is a major abdominal trauma, and it separates bones. It changes how your joints operate. Like, everything in your body changes. So if you're writing a story that has body trauma or body horror and includes pregnancy, really do your research. And obviously nobody on this panel right now is qualified to talk about that, but I do want to encourage I want to encourage everybody that's thinking about writing that to do the research that it needs. And again, because no two birth stories are the same, even if the two birth plans are the same, talk to more than one person. So now that we've talked about Horatio Hornblower, childbirth, and rebar,
so I'll get another one.
I have like a list of questions people sent in, but please jump in. What's our trope?
So one thing that affects a lot of people, especially a lot of combat people these days, is TBIs, traumatic brain injuries, right?
Right.
And I've read a couple of books where people are describing it, and it is one of those things where if you've never had one, it's very hard to describe because it's a very disjointed sort of mental space. So like I'm sure we've all kind of gotten knocked stupid by something. Like we've been doing something, you get smacked upside the head.
An awful lot of people haven't been.
Everything gets blurry. It's really hard to concentrate, right? And then when you start to talk about a traumatic brain injury or a major or minor concussion, even like that just starts compounding, right? So it's like the other part of it is it's not the same every single time. Like I literally have seen stars when I got smacked in the head before, right? Like I fell down on the ground,
like
I saw
the
stars.
bird stars.
Not quite that bad, but close. Like I started laughing because like I was like it's a Looney Tune. Wow, that really does happen, right? But it's all damaged neurons in your brain, and
Right.
depending on where the damage is, it's a different outcome. Like that time, it happened to damage a portion of the optic nerve, so then like there was visual hallucinations involved in it. Like right. I've had friends who got audible hallucinations from getting a concussion to the back, where the impact happened to the back of the head right behind the ear, right? They started hearing things that weren't there, and like it really freaked them out because it was a single side that had happened to, and then the other side wasn't hearing it, so like everything is not
right. The other thing about concussion, right, is that it can take you a while to figure out that you've got one.
Oh yeah, like because you're in a diminished mental space, right? So sometimes it's hard for you in that diminished mental space to realize you're in a diminished mental space, especially if you haven't had multiple of them before, right? If it's something, if it's an
I
old
love
friend,
how you're like, well, I rehearsed concussions, so I know.
if it's an old fashionable friend that you've been with multiple times, it's easier for you to realize that, hey, I'm doing it again. I must be looped, and a good and I'm saying this not to encourage people to do this, but a good analog for it for a lot of people on a baseline is getting really drunk, right? You lose motor skills, everything becomes harder to focus, like you lose visual acuity, right? Balance, all of those things are affected by
memory, short-term and long-term memory.
Major, but a major to medium to moderate to major concussion, those are all classic signs of doing it. And if you really want to see what one feels like I said, that would be one way to do it. It's probably not something you should really go for because you have to get really trashed for it to work.
The other thing that I'm hearing is really, really akin to a TBI from people who have had both is the COVID brain fog. Folks, please don't get COVID just to experience a concussion. I would kind of rather that you got the concussion, honestly. But I really don't love that for you either. I want to talk about your other best friend for a second because it is a really, really, really big movie trope because it's an easy visual. It's
Mhm.
a slightly less common writing trope, but it's still very out there. The broken nose.
Yeah. So yeah, you're
So
right. You see them in
yes,
so many movies, right?
so many movies. They've got the split across the top of the nose. They've gotten hit once, or they fell out of a like face down, and they're just like, and they go like this and go on with their day.
Yeah. And okay, so you can, so generally what that is they have actually dislocated the piece of cartilage here, right? You've all seen a skull where there's the little V notch there, and then your nose
Sure.
is actually a piece of cartilage, right? And part of breaking your nose a lot of the times is you knock that cartilage out of the mounting in your nose in your skull, right? So they do have to put it back in, and you can do that yourself if you're a masochist. Um, but
Does it make more sense just to leave your nose alone and go about your day until a doctor can put it back
you
together?
don't want to touch your face when
Oh,
that happens. Trust me. This is one of those times where shock doesn't do a whole lot of good for you. But yeah, like so the other thing is like um something you very rarely see in movies is like you get two major black eyes, or at least one, depending on how the impact occurred, right? Because you're
sure, because it's
breaking the
gonna.
blood vessels here, and like because that impact that broke, because when you break your nose, you're cracking that bone piece here, right? You can also, like I
Right.
said, dislodge the cartilage. There's a number of different things that can happen. And the most common one that you see in movies is somebody punching them in the face, which is probably actually going to cause a dislocation of that cartilage there.
Right, because you're gonna come across, right?
Right. And breaking a bone is not hard necessarily, but breaking that bone is relatively hard. I did it, but it was by face planting into a like a World War I Jeep that had the little lap seat belts, and somebody pulled out in front of us, and we hit them. And so you
Don't do
can
that
do it,
here.
not recommended, right? So again, it becomes exceptionally, it's very sensitive. It actually throws your balance off to some degree, depending on how much damage was done, right? Because your sinus
The
cavities here can
sinuses.
also be affected, right? And once that's affected, that actually affects your inner ear as well. So
So
I
the other thing with broken noses that gets to me in the movies is that like not only do they not show the black eye, they just like they put a piece of tape over it and then they're fine like tomorrow.
so if all you have done is dislocate the cartilage or um, cause a so another thing that can happen is you can cause a fluid buildup behind it, which causes it to get pushed forward. That is the basic solution for it. They stabilize it. It's almost like a splint, right? So that it's not just a piece of tape. There's actually usually it comes down further because it's going to keep your nose from moving. So it looks
Right.
more like if you think of the old school movies where they put zinc oxide on their nose, it looks like more like that pattern. And it gets taped on there, and it's extremely just uncomfortable. But that is one of the things that they do for it. They also, depending on if you've broken something or if you've massively dislocated and you have a lot of swelling, they'll stuff your nose and your sinus full of cotton.
No, thank you.
Yeah,
I'm
the
just gonna say no, thank you for this whole hour.
the no
Thank you.
thank you part is actually when they pull it out because there's a little string here.
Oh no,
Yeah,
no, no,
yeah,
no, no, thank you.
the doctor was like, okay, I'm going to pull it out on three, and I'm like, what? He goes, I'm going to pull it out on three. He's like, one, two, yoink, and I'm like, that was a movie trope. That was totally a movie trope, but I get why you did it now because oh my, yoink, and he grabbed the other one.
Yep,
uh, yeah, I won't describe what it actually looked like because it was really disgusting. So
thank you. So, but while we're talking about the aftermath of injuries, um, there's a lot of they get a concussion and they get right back on their feet. They get a how long does stuff take to heal that we don't see in the movies?
it really depends. So human bodies heal at different rates, right? So if you think about it,
Yeah, other than like the doctor, but like so somebody gets shot in what's the classic? The shot in the shoulder,
oh, you
right?
don't get shot in the
The
shoulder.
here's a minor injury. Tell me about shot in the. Let me feed you this line. Tell me about shot in the shoulder.
So so in the shoulder space here, there are a number of very important things, not counting your collarbone or the joint itself or the major muscle groups that are damaged. There's also what's called the brachial nerve and arterial complexes up there. One of which controls all the motor function in your arm. and hand. So you could lose the function of the arm or sense or partial of any of those things. Or there's a direct aortic branch that goes up there that provides blood to your arm, right? And so it's about the size and diameter of your pinky. It's almost as large as the femoral artery, which will kill you relatively quickly. And it sits like right about here, where you always see somebody get shot, right? So like getting shot in the shoulder is actually a very bad thing. And if you do, most likely you're going to break a bone. You're going to just you break your shoulder, break your actual shoulder joint, your collarbone, your scapula. All of those things being damaged take a very long time to heal because there's no way to cast them unless they put you in that giant like 1980s era thing where it's
Right,
like
with
this.
the
Yeah,
wires going
and
down
yeah.
and the
So
yeah.
like a lot of the times, like a broken collarbone, you don't cast. You just they put you in a splint, right? But at the same time, it's very hard to immobilize that. So if you ever break your collarbone, it actually is a relatively painful thing to heal. Um,
Not to
and it,
mention that the shoulder joint then is just,
yeah,
as I remember from the last time I jacked my shoulder up, just it's like consensus. Guys,
yeah,
it's not like a ball and socket
yeah,
like the hip. It's just like a bunch of bones that
yeah.
kind of come together
There's a
eventually,
cup
sort of.
like this that's in your shoulder, and then the head of the humerus sits there like this, and then all of this
But
is covered.
it's not a cup like the heel,
No,
like
no,
the
yeah,
um
it's a
it's just
spoon.
kind of a little pocket on the end of the bone
Yeah,
where it sits more than not.
yeah. There's a spoon area where that sits. There's nothing to close around it like there's with your hip, right?
Yeah.
It sits kind of flush like this, and then you've got muscles and tendons that hold it in place. That's your deltoid and your trapezius and all this stuff, right? So like you dislocate that, and a bad one you actually will see the head of the humerus, which is something you never want to see, because that means
Just
it's
like
pushed.
under the
Yeah,
skin,
like
like
it
you
like
just see it popping out.
had a friend of mine do it where it punched out the back like this. Like it was still under the skin, but you could see the head of the humerus against the skin on the back of
Right,
the
because it
shoulder.
just kind of gone sproing.
Yeah, well, it went in it because
No, thank
it got
you.
knocked out of the got out of that knocked out of that tendon muscle pocket and then pushed through the muscle, right?
Right.
Yeah, so like he like in terms of healing, that took him almost 6 months before he was able to actually be functional again at the same capacity he was before, and it was still diminished, right? Like he still lost uh function with his shoulder. Like we'll come back to like when a baseball pitcher throws their shoulder out and it takes them a year or better to get back into the game
Yeah.
again. That's very realistic, right? Because that whole again, there's not a lot they can do to mobilize something like that. It's not like a leg or a hip or something where they can put you in a cast to keep you from moving around.
Yeah.
It, it's very hard to be sanitary with that. So
That's the
like,
other thing too, right? Is that we talk a lot about, oh, well, would this immobilize you during the fight? But like, what about the week after, right? Like, or
oh
the
yeah,
2 weeks after when you're no longer in shock and you have this injury.
yeah, and depending on how bad it is and whether you've gone to the hospital or the doctor and they have loaded you up with some really good drugs to keep you from feeling the pain, or whether you didn't and you're just dealing with aspirin or Tylenol or whatever, right? That changes that whole thing too. And like there's always this trope in movies or books where they're like, I'm not going to take the painkillers, I'm going to man through it or whatever.
Yeah.
That actually greatly extends the amount of time it takes you to heal because you keep re-injuring it due to your stress response, due to a flare of pain causing you to jerk, right? Well, I'm just going to use the shoulder as an example, right? So if you're not taking pain meds, right, and they've got you in that sling where it goes around your chest and your arm is like held like here, right? So it's supporting your shoulder as opposed to hanging.
Yep.
But like if you're not taking your pain meds and something makes you twitch, right? Well, again, all of those muscles and tendons are inflamed, and now you're slamming the head of that humerus around in there, which is going to cause it to tear more, which is going to take longer. It's also going to build up more scar tissue. So, like the whole point, I wouldn't say the whole point, but a big point of the reason that people are on pain meds for injuries like this is to limit their pain response to increase their time, increase their ability to heal faster, so decrease their overall healing time.
Right. Less
There are other
cortisol,
reasons.
more healing.
Yeah, there are other reasons. Just like nobody wants to hear somebody lie there and scream for 6 weeks.
Yeah. Yeah. Please don't do that.
Yeah,
The elephant in the room, of course, that I want to acknowledge is that there are psychological effects to being injured or to being repeatedly injured or to being in places where you see people injured around
yeah,
you. And folks, if you are writing injuries and fighting and you're not dealing with PTSD and CPTSD, go get yourself some resources. Remember that despite the fact that I am totally using him like one today, veterans are not zoo animals.
No. So speaking of a older piece of art that's out there, there are a couple of very good scenes in the movie Band of Brothers, which is a movie about World War II, where you see the field medical tents and the place they got evacuated to in Britain, right? And MASH does a reasonably good job of it. MASH is a lot more dramatized, right? People are like magically not bloody and all that, but
the 70s was a very clean time.
Yeah. So, but Band of Brothers does a really good job of. There is a very poignant set of scenes during the Battle of Bastogne, where their medics are treating wounded in what was a cathedral, right?
Right.
And as you walk in, you see this giant pile of boots outside, right? Because they're actually cut off from everybody at that point, and boots are a fungible resource, so they didn't want to just throw them away. They kept them.
Right.
But it's very poignant in the fact that that's a lot of boots, that's a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
And there are some, I will say there are some very bloody scenes involved in that episode where they're treating people within that wounded space, but it also gives you an idea of what field medicine really looks like, right? Like it's not easy, it's not clean, right? There's a lot of screaming and cursing involved in it.
So while we're talking about field medicine, there's so many tropes, not just about field medics or but what you are going to do to yourself in the field if you get injured. And I know a lot of I'm just going to front, I have run a number of Spartan races, and this involves standing next to a number of dudes who mostly live on, Axe and energy drinks, and who are absolutely 100% convinced that not only can they put their own dislocated shoulders back in, they can sew themselves up.
You can self-stitch if you know how to do a suture, which is not just sewing, right? It is exceptionally painful. It is, if you have to do it to prevent a further injury, again,
right, you do what you've got to do.
You do what you got to do, and your body will deal with it. It still hurts, right? I had to get stitches a couple of times without anesthesia, and that's not something I really want to go through again.
It's a bigger chunk of skin and meat than people think it is, right?
Yeah.
They think it's this little skin pinch, but you've got to get in there.
Yeah, you've got to get under it because you don't want to, they go pretty deep so that the suture doesn't tear through the dermal and epidermal layer. They go down into the meat to keep everything together. It's not a pleasant process. Relocating.
We're heading into fall, folks. As you are trussing your chickens and turkeys and geese and things, if you eat meat, and if that is your holiday tradition, think about that in terms of suturing. And writers are weird, but maybe practice. Maybe practice on your chicken or your turkey. See what it actually takes to push a needle through some skin and some flesh.
And also, when you're doing that, realize that when you're doing it to a live human being,
they're moving,
they're twitching, they're jumping. Even if they've been given lidocaine or some other sort of local anesthetic, when you're giving that to them, the muscle still twitches, right? You're still going to have jumps, right? And you're still trying to push something through that, and it's not fun. Yeah.
But we have some really amazing things out there now, right? If folks are writing in contemporary, modern or science fiction, I know in my first aid kit, which I have because you recommended it, there's the magic sutures that they glue on and then you just pull it tight. It's like a little zip tie.
They actually got so if you think about them kind of like a you remember the old days bandages had the little metal clips on
Yeah,
them?
the little gravities.
Yeah, they almost work like that, except that there is a zip tie in the middle of those. So they adhere down, but they also have little teeth that dig into the skin, right?
Okay.
So when you've got a cut, right, you apply them to both sides of that, and you pull that zip tie till the skin touches, right, and then you snip the ends of that, and then you cover that with a bandage, right?
Great. Not ideal, but it'll get you somewhere you can get a better
It,
job
it
done.
actually works pretty well. Like if a butterfly is not going to cover it, and like you've got it, like I'll use the term, when the wound is gaping, right, when it's opened up and you start to see it like form the pocket, right, because the
Yeah,
skin is
it
pulling. Yeah,
pulls apart.
yeah, like, which is generally the rule when you want to get a suture in the first place, if the wound is gaping or if you can see bone or muscular tissue underneath, right? So those are a good mid-grade solution. Like, I'm not going to put them on some place where I need to get 7 stitches, or if I'm going to like be a lot of moving around, like, so if it's on my forearm or my wrist, or like if it's my forearm, probably those would work great, or my quad, or my right, or my wrist or hands, probably not, right? Places
Yeah,
where skin's going to move a lot, they're going to come up. Just same problem as a butterfly, right?
yeah,
Um, so another thing that pretty much everybody should carry in a modern or historical sense is a tourniquet, right?
yep.
Like, you always see the thing where people like take their belt and use it to do that, and they turn it and turn it and turn it and then stick it underneath. That works, right? But in the modern sense, like, tourniquets are cheap and they're not very big, right? So that it's something that like pretty much everybody should have in their car. Like it is a very basic set of very basic first aid tool that you can use that can save somebody's life if there was a car accident. And you don't even need, like, get the training on it, obviously, but there's not a lot of training,
And
right?
they're small, right? Like my tourniquet in my kit is like this big.
Yeah. Yeah, they're
It's like a little bungee cord.
yeah, basically it's a bungee cord and there's a metal hook on the end, because you pull it around, there's a loop on one end, and then there's a hook on the base of that loop. So you put it through there and you pull it tight, right? Because
Right.
what you want to do, the trick to it is at the end of the extremity, you want to be able to not find a pulse.
So folks, no tourniquets on neck wounds.
Those are, yeah, no. But like, so if you're putting a tourniquet on somebody's leg, right, you put it above the injury, right, and then you check their ankle usually, because you usually have a pretty big uh, vein right there on the inside of your ankle bone, and you check to see if you can feel a pulse there anymore, right? So the reason you don't want to feel a pulse, or you want to feel
Right.
a
You
very
tried to
light
cut off
pulse,
the blood, and if there's a
right,
pulse, you
right,
haven't done that. While we're on the subject, Chris mentioning, take the class, learn how. Take a first aid class.
yeah,
They're out there. They're available. There are tons. I do not get paid to endorse mymedic.com, but I know they've got a lot of resources. I'm trying to think. The Red Cross has resources. Your local community college, if you're in the U.S., is going to have resources. Is going
yeah,
to have first aid classes. Um, Take them. Ask questions. They're going to have knowledgeable people. It's
yeah.
a way to get a sensitivity read question asked, or a research question asked, and gain some valuable skills in the process, like
Yeah.
how to put a tourniquet on.
Yeah, there are most
Okay.
community colleges will teach an EMS class. Like, essentially, it's like the first level of being a paramedic. It'll be a couple of weeks. It'll cost you 100 or $200, and it will go over things like, here's CPR, here is how to use an automated defibrillator, like all of these things that you would see in most trauma situations they go over. Right? It's not intended to make you a paramedic, but it gives you the first step of that, so you know what they talk about when
Right. And while I know a couple $100 can sound like a lot for some people, for many people, honestly, I want to acknowledge,
Yeah,
one thing that y'all can do is your writing group can put money together, and everybody can chip in $10 and one of you can go.
yeah,
And then you've got 10 people's questions getting asked for the price of one person. Red Cross is going to run it cheaper. A lot of libraries now are running stuff, especially in terms of classes for using Narcan,
yep,
and emergency street first aid. If you have a local street medics group, I know a lot of cities have publicized street medic groups, the city doesn't publicize it, understand. But especially in the US after the 2020 protests, a lot of the street medics have put information out in the street medic groups. I know Portland Street Medics has stuff out there. And that is another road to finding somebody that you can ask questions.
Yep.
Ask the question. Find a person who knows and ask the question.
And the
what
other
are
thing
you
is
not getting up from that everybody in a movie thinks that you can get up from while I'm on writer stuff?
If you break your leg, you are probably not going to walk that off. So many times you see somebody with I'm not talking like a compound fracture, which you know somebody's not going to walk away from, but like this guy jumped off of a 2-story building, landed wrong, you heard the crack, right? And then you see him limping off. Not going to happen, right?
Even if you're hopping, right? Your leg's going to dangle and swing.
If you're putting weight on that, like even if it's just a green stick fracture, it hurts, right? Unless you have zombies chasing you or, again, a velociraptor, you're probably just going to lay there and cry until somebody helps you. I mean, or if it's a case of, exposure, right? You do that at, 2 o'clock in the morning on
drag yourself,
January 4th, you're going to get out of there. Like you're like either that or you're just going to lie there and die. But realistically, most people will get the gumption to pull themselves out of the snow into a place that's a little bit warmer, but yeah, like a broken leg is not something people are just going to walk off. Yeah.
The other one that always say, oh, the bullet just grazed them.
Oh yeah, that actually hurts worse. Have you ever, like, I'm sure we've all cut ourselves with a kitchen knife, right? That hurts. Like it when it first happens, it doesn't hurt, but then as the nerves start to realize they've been severed, that really starts to hurt. Well, multiply that by a large number because you've basically torn a channel there. It's not a clean cut. It's like using the back of the knife to cut yourself with.
Right.
It's
I heard it's also like when you burn yourself on the oven, like we've all sort of done and like lifted up and you get that wide band of just like I touched the heating element of my toaster oven, ouch.
Yeah, except it's also deeper than that because once you graze, right? Because then you have secondary trauma because there's the cut to the skin and the fascia, right? But then there's the thermal and the concussive damage that goes further deep in there. So back in the 80s and 90s when they first started issuing cops bulletproof vests, they went for a very, very light vest that stopped the bullet, right? And this caused a lot of people to actually die that might not have. Because when the round, so we're going to go back to physics on this. When the round hits
transfer,
that,
right?
Yeah, when the round hit that, the chest plate in the body armor stopped it, right? But then that kinetic energy was still transferred directly to the body underneath, right? So it creates a pocket of essentially pulverized flesh.
Right.
So when I was in, we were using what was called the Interceptor body armor system. There's a
really good YouTube that does ballistic impacts over and under plates, and you can see the things. Folks, look, I have no idea. If somebody finds it before I do, put it in the comments for everybody, please. Thank you. I love you forever.
So what I was getting at is the modern body armor that we used, and they still use in the military, consists of a Cordova carrier, just like what you like a hiking backpack or a camelback cover, right? A little bit heavier of weight of that, and then inside of that, we had 40-layer Kevlar in like a vest. Like there was 2 pieces of it that velcro together inside of it, but it's in the shape of a vest, right? There's a front piece and a back piece, and then there are side pieces, right? And those were rated for mostly handgun rounds, right? So the way Kevlar works is essentially a mesh fabric laid on top of a mesh fabric. And when the bullet hits, it pushes through that. And then 40 layers of that, basically it keeps slowing down because it's opposing layers. And then that bullet has to push through all those fibers and it slows down and eventually doesn't penetrate. Right.
So this is the same technology that has been in use for about a gazillion years. It is the anti-penetration armor that you use for fencing foils. Yep. If you go back to Three Musketeers and everybody's getting stabbed with the épée, it's the same thing. You can do it with 3 layers of silk, 5 layers of silk, and stop a sword Obviously, it takes a little bit more than that to stop a bullet, but it is the same technology. So if you're looking at something in the past, if you're looking at something in the present, look at the history of it.
Yeah. So the IBAs were multi-layer systems. So we had the 40-layer soft Kevlar, which is soft, right? It's heavy, right? With at that point the body armor weighed, I think, 16 pounds. Okay. And then we added, when we started to go into actual combat situation, we started getting what were called SAPI plates, which are essentially a piece of ceramic that's about an inch to an inch and a half thick, right? And there's a central stabilizing piece in the middle of that. But what happens is, and then there's and then there's a wrap of hardened Kevlar around the outside of it. So what happens with that is, when the higher caliber rounds hit that, it breaks a segment of that plate, again doing a kinetic transfer, right? So it's still
like helmets.
Yeah. So it still usually penetrates that plate, right? But it's been slowed down such significantly that the padding underneath can then stop the rest of that bullet. But the problem that a lot of people had originally with plates is they were super heavy, right? So the IBA system was 32 pounds, right? For a person my size, it was 32 pounds.
Okay, so you're no longer carrying like a medium to large cat worth of weight. You are now carrying a medium to large dog worth of weight.
It's interesting because like part of the design of this goes back to the design of NASA spacesuits, where they went back and looked at medieval armor and how it fits on people and how they were able to wear it and move, right? So you look at it, and the design of the IBA is very similar to a plate.
It's the Visby plate, guys.
Yeah.
If you're familiar with the Visby plate, it's the Visby plate.
Right.
And this is funny because I used to do reenactment and I fought in Visby plate.
Right. So it's designed so that it balances very well in your body. So you're carrying that 32 pounds, but it doesn't necessarily feel like it. And it's also, it is constrictive because you want to wear it tightly around yourself, right? So like when you put it on, the way it was set up is the SAPI plate goes across an interior flap and Velcros down. And then there's an outside plate that goes over the top of that, and that holds everything tight, right? Because again, you don't want this moving around. It's 32 pounds of crap on your body. And if you're running, you don't want that to slide around and chafe and all that stuff. So you're wearing it relatively tight. You're wearing it almost like you're wearing spandex. You want it almost that tight, but you also want it loose enough that you can breathe. The problem with the set of body armor before that is they were using solid steel plates, right? So the vest itself was about the same weight. It was about 16 to 17 pounds for the vest. And then you had a 27 pound or 20 pound front plate and a 16 pound back plate.
Right.
Right. So there's a scene in Black Hawk Down where a guy's talking about, well, I'm not going to run away from the bad guy. So he takes his back plate out of his body armor. And he's like, the extra 10 pounds, I'd rather not carry the extra 10 pounds. I'm not going to run away from the other guys. Right. Inevitably, he gets shot in the back because it's a movie. But that was the thing people did is, they would take the strike plates out because they're like, I don't need that weight. Right. This is. Yeah. And then all of a sudden the body armor is essentially compromised. It's no longer useful, right? Because most modern warfare uses rounds that are much higher velocity than that.
This is a reminder. Feed Rowan.
Feed me. Sorry about the echo there, folks. I've got like the mic set up and everything.
So anyway, like that's but the reason I'm talking about that is like that's the thing that people do, right? When you're wearing body armor, you try and make it as light as you possibly can, right? Because you have to wear that all the time, every day, all the time, right? So
right, but it still has to be heavy enough to deal with the kinetic transfer.
Right, and the interesting transition on the SAPI plate was that it's essentially a fungible resource, right? It gets hit, it's no longer useful. You replace it and you move on with your day, right? Technically, you replace the whole vest, but the steel plates were actually supposed to be useful for multiple strikes.
I want to put a pin in something that you said, though. So one of the things that I see a lot with new writers who are trying to write fight scenes, battle scenes, injuries, getting shot. Do you want to be shot with a tiny bullet or a big bullet?
Oh, well, that really depends. Like, are you wearing body armor? Or where's it going to strike? So I'll use an example. A 22, which is a very small bullet, tiny, and is very much thought of as kind of a useless round, is actually commonly used by a lot of assassins. It is an exceptionally useful round when they get extremely close to you and they fire it, because what happens is the bullet doesn't then exit.
So it
Right.
tumbles in the body.
It goes in there and it'll bounce off a rib, or it'll enter the skull and just bounce around inside, all sorts of nasty things. But again, it also stays in there, so it's a foreign body that they're essentially going to have to remove at some point if you survive the actual shot itself. You'll hear about kinetic transfer, and you'll hear about loss of kinetic transfer if you're using this is something you hear with hunters too, right? So if you're shooting a deer and you use a super high velocity round and it punches through and through, does that actually do as good of a job as a round that goes in and stays, right?
Right.
If you puncture
I see a lot of writers being like, the bigger the bullet, the more dramatic the injury.
Well, the bigger the bullet, the more dramatic the shot. But again, there is a author who I won't name because he's a relatively large, well-known mystery writer. His main character in several of his books was carrying around a 22 caliber revolver, and he's talking about how big it was. Right. So, yeah, like there's some of that stuff where people don't really understand.
Folks, if you're going to put guns in your book, find a way to go handle some guns.
Yeah.
You can go down to a range, you can take a class. Even if you're in a country where access to guns is pretty restricted, a lot of times you are able to go at least like have a gun experience in that way, so that you can see if one is heavy or if it's light. If you can't do that, get a friend in the US, because by God, people in the US have a lot of guns, and they would be thrilled to show you their guns and to get on Zoom and talk about how big something is, so you can actually see a gun that is in proportion to a human being. And so that you can see bullets that are in proportion to a human being. When Chris was talking about a 22 bullet being small, it's really small. It's like the size of my pinky nail. It's really small. I mean, the cartridge is bigger.
No,
but the bullet itself is so small.
The entire cartridge is only about, yeah. So,
but like, you know,
yeah.
And a 9mm and a 38, they're the same size.
So the bullet is the same size, yeah. So the thing when people are talking about bullets, and I'll go over this real quick because it's actually pretty self-explanatory. When you hear somebody say it's a 9mm, that's the diameter of the bullet itself, not the cartridge or the shell or anything like that. It's the diameter of the bullet, right?
Yeah.
Has nothing to do with the length of the bullet, but that's its diameter. So a 22 is 0.22 inches, right? So a 22, a 45, a 38, 57. Those are all decimal, whatever that number is, inches in diameter, right? 9mm, it's the same thing, except that we're just using the metric system. We're saying it's 9mm.
It's literally a 9mm,
right.
Yeah.
You'll also see people refer to something as like 5.56mm by 45. Okay. Mm-hmm. So that is the diameter of the bullet, and then the by 45 is the length of the casing itself, right? So it's 45mm in length, and the bullet
the longer casing gives you room for more powder. Yeah.
Yeah.
So like a sniper round is like thin but long.
So there's also the fact that most rifle rounds are necked down. So if you look at them, you'll see where the bullet goes and it gets bigger, and then the casing will go over the back of that, and then it'll get bigger again. Right? Usually with like a shoulder step. Right? All of that is the intent that you put more powder, more propellant behind the bullet, and it travels faster, has more impact.
So if you get hit with one of these bullets, if you get hit with a rifle round versus a handgun round versus when you get hit in the body armor, does it knock you over? Do you kind of shrug it off? Does it? I mean, I understand that some can penetrate.
So the best
doesn't matter
explanation,
where in the armor you get hit.
The best visceral response I ever, or explanation I had to this was a friend of mine said, after he got shot in the body armor by an AK-47, he was like, it was like standing in front of a fast pitch baseball machine and taking and letting the ball hit you smack in the middle of the chest.
That's a great visualization.
Yeah, and yeah, because like it's there's
So even
that.
if you're wearing body armor, you're gonna have bruising, you're gonna
Yeah,
have
yeah, you're gonna
like
have
maybe
bruising,
broken ribs.
probably broken ribs. Like handgun rounds probably aren't going to break your ribs, but rifle rounds definitely will. Um,
People are really casual about broken ribs in movies and books.
oh, that sucks.
Real casual about it. Right up until it punctures the lung, right? But
Right, but just moving around with a cracked rib is agony, right? Like it, yeah, it's not. Yeah, like you at that point you're basically wearing a corset of ace bandages to try and keep everything from shifting around for a couple of weeks.
yeah,
And you're not just going to go right back out and go fighting again. It's you're down for several weeks to a month.
yeah. So yeah, so you're not just gonna, because that seems to be the trope, right? Is that like you get shot, it cracks some ribs, but you're gonna walk it off, and then while you're walking it off, one of those cracked ribs like finishes shattering and punctures your lung, and then you have pneumothorax.
No, that actually requires a lot more effort to, like, once you get a cracked rib, getting it broken requires a lot more effort. And that's, and again, when we talk about like when you're wearing body armor, how it's relatively constricted, that's also a portion of it. It's like it's kind of like when you sprain your ankle, you don't take the boot off,
Right.
right? You use it as a splint. Same kind of idea. If you take a round or rounds to the body armor or the chest area, if you're not bleeding, you're probably not going to take that body armor back until you get to a treatment facility.
So it's more realistic than I thought to sort of get shot in combat, shrug it off, and then you take your body armor off and all the
Well,
that's a terrible sound effect. But
it,
like all of a sudden the wounds that had compression on them no longer have compression, and
yeah, but
shock
like
is worn off, and
you're also probably not going to have a fully broken rib that's going to puncture into your organ cavity if the round has not penetrated the vest itself, right? When you take it off, there's definitely a lot of whimpering and possibly screaming because yeah, it really hurts, and usually you have to have somebody else help you take your body armor off because usually by that point it's been at least half an hour, if not longer, right? It does restrict your movement at that point though, right? Because it still hurts. Don't get me wrong. It hurts, right? And it just hurts worse once you take it off. Because then everything has a chance to like.
so besides the shoulder, what's the injury that people think that you could walk off? I mean, I guess we got shoulder and broken leg. What else aren't you walking off?
Almost anything. Like, it's really hard to walk. Like unless you're actually wearing protective gear, there's not a lot of bullet wounds you're just going to walk off. Like that's a massive trauma to your system, right? There's a term that they use called cavication, right? So if you ever watch you ever watch them shoot a bullet into ballistic gel, okay? They're all over YouTube. You can actually see this. You'll see the round penetrate, and then as it's going through, it creates this big channel as it goes through, and then the ballistic gel closes back down, right? But you have to think that that's the channel that's punched through the flesh of the person that just got shot, muscle, the right, all of that
All
stuff.
that stuff is basically in a blender.
Right. So it's like if you get shot, wherever you got shot, there's going to be a lot of additional damage, right? Like you can get shot in the arm and maybe walk it off, but at the same time, you're not going to use that arm, right? Not unless it's not. The caveat obviously is life or death. You do a lot of things that you didn't think you could normally do.
Right.
But given the choice, if you get winged in the arm, we're back to just a flesh wound. You're still not going to want to use that arm. You're going to want to go like put some lidocaine gel on that, put some Celox on it, put a Band-Aid on it, and not use it for a couple of days because that hurt, right? And you also, again, you like it's damaging the nerves and the nerve response in that arm, right? So once you go into shock, you actually do start to lose tactile response. You lose dexterity, right? And while shock
I know the last time I was in shock, I got real dumb.
shock is systemic, right? But it's also slightly generalized, right? So like if you get shot in the right arm, like your right arm is going to have a lot more of a response than the rest of your body because the rest of your body is doing things to boost that area.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Right, but you're still diverting blood from other organs. Your thought processes change, your responses change. It's part of why people drill so much, right?
Right. So it's also not your body isn't rushing blood to to the injured location. When you become
No.
injured, what your body does is it pushes the blood into your core. It's just like when you get cold, right? Like when you start to go hypothermic, your body is bringing as much blood back to its core, away from your brain and your extremities, to
Right.
keep your
You don't need those.
right to keep your right because once
Yeah,
you're
stay alive. Stay alive,
stay
and then we'll
alive,
figure out the brain and the extremities.
yeah. And it's the same thing when you start to go into shock. That's why you get pale. It's why you get like woozy. It's because it's pulled the blood from everywhere into your core, right? It does
Right.
reduce bleeding, but also it makes you a little bit loopy because now your brain doesn't have as much blood flow. You lose, and we get back to the whole drunk thing again, right?
Yeah. Um, I feel like it would be disappointing, to me at least, if we didn't at least mention the Boromir principle, where where and I remember, like, I used to read Lord of the Rings as my comfort read when I was a kid. When I'd get sick, it would take me approximately as long to read Lord of the Rings as it would to get better from the flu. Um, but or strep throat, which I had all the time. How did I get strep every year? I was a worthless child with a worthless immune system.
Mag
Um,
skills.
but anyway, I didn't really have the sense until I saw, Peter Jackson's hugely dramatic version that Boromir was getting shot like again and again and again and again, and there's all of these arrows. Like, did the timing on that scene feel good to you when you watched
So
it?
I'll
I mean, good job leaving the arrows in, but they were huge.
well also so there's so I'll use the term it's almost like a suicide bomber intent, right? Some people when they get to the point that they know they're dying, right,
Right.
they just don't care anymore, right? Their body is essentially overridden their pain response because they're so heavily into shock they keep moving, right? So in the case of Boromir, like we're talking, every time he moves the broadheads on those arrows are going to continue to cut into his flesh, right? And your body can keep going for quite a while if you don't care, right?
Right.
Like if you've basically been like, I'm giving up self-preservation, I'm just going to keep going, your body can go for quite a while until basically you don't have blood left and you can't supply oxygen to your muscle groups. You'll keep going. Like you see it
And
a
then you'll
lot
have
in,
this tearful scene with Aragorn that
well, you're not going to cry anymore because you're dead, but Aragorn might.
the
Like,
rest of us did.
yeah, I'm just saying, like, Boromir probably wouldn't be talking at the end of that scene.
Okay.
Like, by the time he's done that, like, he's essentially
Who
an
tend
oxygen.
to talk really well when they're injured in movies and books? Like, they're really articulate. Is that realistic?
Usually, I just cuss a lot. Like, I'm
I
I'm
like that you
not.
have a baseline. That's my favorite part.
Like, so that, it's one of these things. Like, does it actually make it feel better? No, but it makes me feel better.
Okay.
Right,
Yeah.
but like, yeah, like talking while you're injured, especially if you're with a chest wound, you're not going to do a lot of talking because that really hurts, right? If it's an extremity injury, you're probably just cursing a lot because that really hurts. And even though you can't, talking doesn't hurt it. Like you need to do something to kill the pain.
So remember, folks, that really hurts. Um, we are getting down to the end of time, and I think I've gotten through all of the questions that folks sent in. But again, if you had a ticket for this session and your question did not get answered, hit us up on Discord, email us. We will make sure that we get you an answer, because this is on us. But Chris, do you have anything that you want to say about getting shot before we?
Aside from don't
Not
do it.
necessarily specifically good. Don't do it. I don't like that for you. But it's just like, what's your favorite injury trope? What one works for you or doesn't work for you?
So I'm gonna go back to the whole like blown away thing. Like I don't know if everybody's seen the Mythbusters episode where they try and disprove the fact that people get thrown around when they get shot, right?
Right.
Because they don't, right? Like it all comes back to Newton's laws, the whole equal and opposite thing. There's not enough mass and speed to overcome
Oh, so when
the
like somebody gets shot and you see them flying backwards like this.
right, or like when the hand grenade goes off and they get blown to the side. There's just not enough kinetic energy involved in those situations. Like with a hand grenade, they're probably just going to get pulped if they're close enough to actually get moved, right? So,
Right. Yeah, so the shockwave is just not that big.
right.
I mean, it is, but it isn't.
If you're close enough to get moved by it, you're going to be in the shrapnel radius, uh, and that's not, that's 3 to 5 meters. It's
So the trope of the blast mostly blew me out of the way of the injury, not
yeah.
so much.
If you're that close to the explosion, the blast pretty much turned you to jelly, even if there wasn't shrapnel.
Point of the explosion.
Yeah. So another one is shotguns are not a miraculous weapon that you can fire at somebody from like 30 feet away and it will hit everybody within 10 feet of them.
What?
At about I think it's about
I want
10
a
to
refund for Days Gone.
10, at about 10 to 15 feet, the spread of a shotgun blast, a 12 gauge shotgun, is about 21 inches, right? And it's not 100% coverage in there, but once you get past that, bullets start spreading out more, and then like you can literally stand in a shotgun blast and not get hit by something, right? Because like everything spreads.
Right.
So yeah, shotguns are not magic weapons that will hit everything in a contained zone. Grenades have a limited range, but if you are that close to them, you're probably toast.
Yeah. That's the other thing that I wanted to bug you about. People seem to have an unrealistic idea when they're writing these things about ranges. And I know that we didn't have you on here actually to talk about shooting. We had you on here to talk about getting shot. But handguns. Are you really gonna shoot somebody, across the Titanic with one?
So on average,
People have.
On average, a handgun is useful up to 20 to 25 feet. Past that, you actually start to get outside of the effective range of the weapon. U.S. military trains with the M4, M16 systems between 300 and 500 meters is the maximum range they train on, right? You have what's known as maximum range and maximum effective range for weapon system for bullets, and that's all you can look that up, right? But like we'll go back to the 22, right? A 22 is actually deadly out to 2 miles, right? A little tiny bullet.
If you can get the bullet there.
The bullet can kill somebody at 2 miles. It's just the question of whether you're going to hit within 16 miles of where you were aiming at that distance.
So
right?
You're going to kill somebody else on the what goes up must come down principle,
exactly.
And there are no warning shots principle.
Yeah, but if you shoot at somebody with a little tiny round like that, everything affects it. Wind, gravity, right? To actually go 2 miles, you pretty much have to be shooting like a 70, 80 degree angle, and then maybe it'll come within a county of where you fired. We're aiming, right?
Right.
So I think that the longest shot right now is something over the longest effective sniper round.
That's a lot, though.
And the guy was shooting from mountaintop to mountaintop in Afghanistan at like 13,000 feet, right?
Right. So there's no air.
Lower air resistance. He was also shooting at a target that was lower than him. He was using a 50 caliber rifle. All kinds of things add up for this. It's not the shot that you make every day, right? But it is.
But it is a shot that someone has made.
Yeah.
So, folks, when you're writing this, remember that we have talked about everything from what would usually happen to outliers to. So when you think about your injury, don't always make your character the stoic, though. Like, the injury kind of loses the meaning if your character can always shrug it off too, unless they're Deadpool, in which case, good luck.
Yeah.
Or my personal favorite, the Old Guard, where I'm still trying to figure out if any of the wounds in there are realistic, not just in the sense that all of the characters are immortal, but in the sense that, I mean, no spoilers, guys, the movie's 3 years old. In the sense that one of the characters becomes mortal and now does not instantly heal from these injuries and is dealing with fallout from the injury and is in constant pain. And I'm like, I feel like you would respond to that differently no matter how many times you had been injured and healed instantly.
Mm-hmm.
But that's my rant, and we're here for your rant. And we have taken up an hour of your time, and I really, really appreciate you agreeing to come on and let me pester you. And folks, everything that I said about questions, all the YouTube things, the links are down there. And we will see you next month for, I think we are far enough into a video that YouTube isn't going to destroy us for dropping an F-bomb. We'll see how long we make it through this panel next month before somebody says monster fucker. So good luck to us, and we'll see you next month.